Hi, Blastpop here. Today I am taking a look at Search and Destroy Tactical Combat in Vietnam 1965 to 1966. This was designed by the late John M. Young and was published in 1975 by SPI in this flat box edition. In addition, this is sort of the game that was a follow-on to the earlier Grunt, also I believe designed by John M. Young. It's a very tactical game, and I acquired it when it first was released in 1975, and I think it was rather unique for the era, and due to the history of the Vietnam War, it may not have been as popular then as it would be today if it was now released, given the time for the history to have percolated and a chance for some of the wounds to be somewhat mended in the interim. This game came out at a time when the feelings were still raw from the Vietnam War, and while the feelings may still be vivid, some time has had passed to allow people to reflect a little bit over that period of time. Having been published nearly 45 years ago, the production values and the the quality of the components obviously differs. It's amazing what the Redmond Simonson did, who was the graphics director at SPI, managed to do with limited printing capabilities. Anyway, the back here describes exactly what's in the game. Anyway, Search and Destroy is a game of ground combat in South Vietnam. It simulates platoon, company, and battalion level actions where the U.S., ARVN, and U.S. forces opposes the NLF player. These actions scenarios are of two basic types: a U.S. helidrop into VC or NVA territory, or a land drive, sometimes with armor, to clear an area thought to contain communist forces. A basic feature of the game is that the NLF forces are face down throughout the game and indistinguishable from dummy units and peasant markers. Optional rules include the ability for NLF units intensifying fire while expending ammunition supply and medical evaluation of U.S. personnel. Lastly, there are rules permitting the normal sequential movement system to be converted into a simultaneous system. Search and Destroy is a game that covers the critical period of the Second Indochina War, in which the U.S. could have salvaged a military victory, and exposes many of the ultimate reasons why it did not. Okay, this game includes a rules book, includes a 22 by 34 map, and 400 game pieces. The rules are split into a basic, standard, and advanced rules. The entire rules book, including covers, scenarios, and is complete at a mere 16 pages. SPI system allowed for a very efficient use of rules writing that covered a lot of ground in a small space and was efficient in the conveying of the rules. Here's a sample of the counters, and I have a sample right here of some of the actual counters. And I always thought these were unique in the presentation because they had military NATO symbols as well as pictographs and silhouettes. So an example, right here we have airstrike, center of impact, artillery center of impact, KIA and pin markers, from combat results. U.S. ground forces, U.S. ground leadership, and let's see, forward observers, American Medical Aid, M113, ARVN Rangers, anti-personnel traps, peasants, porters, VC hardcore regulars, NLF hardcore regulars, VC militia, ammunition cache, arms cache, anti-tank mines, radio equipment, administrative records, ambush, rice cache, improved positions, and dummies. Now, of all the markers that were included, and there's others as well, but this gives you a sample. They were very evocative during the time, except for the dummy, which is just a basic outline of a rectangle. But it was very interesting, I thought, in the presentation at that time. Aside from the markers, the basic rules are fairly short and are only a few pages in length, starting here after your introductory information and your sequence of play. You have movement and combat, and then the other player does the same thing. They have a separate sequence of play for the standard game, which has a movement phase, a search phase, a combat, and a cache destruction phase. And then you got pin removals, and then likewise you have a second player turn. So you have your movement, destroying of non-personnel units, anti-personnel units, combat, line of sight, combat results, terrain effects chart, which is actually over here on the map, which I'll show a little bit later, setting up of the game, and victory conditions. Very short rules. Then you start the standard game on page 7 for hiding, you search, limitations of search, leadership, standard deployment, and then you have a standard order of battles and variable order of battles. Where the real, I think, the interesting game comes into play is when you start adding the advanced game, where you have optional rules, where you actually have scenario play as opposed to generic random situation, so to speak, by the roll of a die. You have ambush, movement and fire, casualty results. You have 2 combat results table in the game, the basic game and essentially an advanced game casualty results. You have rules for airstrikes, artillery bombardment, tanks and APCs, organization of forces, interrogation, so you can find out where the VC might have forces hidden. And then you have optional scenarios, and there's about a dozen of those. They're based historically on a map which is sort of generic. And then the application of an alternate simultaneous movement system. I was never a fan of the simultaneous movement systems that SPI seemed to like during the mid-1970s. You have game notes, and then you have some additional order of battle information and charts. In the counter tray here, you can see a sampling of the various units, and here's an M113 close-up. They're printed one side. They're brown core, and by today's standard brown core, they're probably considered thin. You have a matte finish, and it's not too bad in terms of feel. Then, of course, during play, the VC, their forces would be on the map upside down. And you can differentiate that military unit from peasants also on the board. So it gives you a sense of what's going on, what the map looks like during play, just a little bit. Essentially, you have brown with a bluish-green map, terrains and stuff. So essentially what could be construed as two-color. And you have your obvious open terrain, building hexes, broken terrain. You have berms, you have your road, bridge, and essentially what is various villages on the map. And what I like, and some people don't prefer, is they have a lot of the needed charts in a handy-dandy place right on the map, an easy reference to the players instead of having a separate flip chart to look at. I like this for fairly simple games, and SPI did this a lot in the 1970s and 80s. And if a game has this map space for it, I wish more companies would include maps that have the charts easily available during play. But that's my opinion. I played this game quite a bit in the 1970s and always kind of enjoyed it. And as I alluded to earlier in the video, the subject matter was not a popular subject matter to have a game after such a short period of time after the war had ceased. I thought it was interesting and never really gained a popularity. Although one thing I will note that back in the 1970s there was actually an article in the New York Times about this game being available. And I have a copy of that article somewhere in my archives. So I thought that was kind of interesting. They talk about search and destroy and the being a controversial tactic. And while the name of the game is search and destroy, there's more set piece battles in the scenarios and such. So it's not strictly search and destroy actions, although the basic and intermediate games tend to use that as their main implementation of gameplay. Anyway, this has been a video of Search and Destroy by SPI, designed by the late John M. Young. Please like, comment, and subscribe. This has been Blastpop. Bye.